Today we're going to do some proofs on the topic of proving lines parallel. Our first proof has a given information as angle 5 is congruent to angle 7, and we're trying to prove that line A is parallel to line B. So our first information, again, we have angle 5 is congruent to angle 7, so I'm going to mark my diagram. Now from here, I also notice that angle 6 is congruent to angle 7, and that's because there are vertical angles, and vertical angles are congruent. So I notice that now that 6 and 7 are congruent, which also makes 5 and 6 congruent. Now, in trying to prove line A is parallel to line B, I notice that if I can prove 5 and 6 congruent, if I can prove these two are congruent, which I have, then I can say that this line right here is my transversal, which would make 5 and 6 corresponding, which in return would make A and B parallel. So it's kind of my plan. I'm thinking about talking about it out loud. So the first thing I need to do in the next step is I need to say, because 5 is congruent to 7 and 6 is congruent to 7, I know that angle 5 is also congruent to angle 6, and that's through substitution. So now that we have stated that angle 5 and angle 6 are congruent, I can say that line A and B are parallel. Line A is parallel to line B, and that is because if two lines are cut by a transversal, and corresponding angles are congruent, which we proved because 5 and 6 are congruent and they're corresponding, then the lines are parallel. Our next proof says that X and Y are parallel lines, and we're trying to prove that angle 2 is supplementary to angle 5. So let's mark what we're trying to get to. So I'm trying to say that 2 is supplementary to 5, so I'm looking to add them together and get to 180. Now one thing that also sticks out in my proof that angle 3 and angle 5, they're vertical. So that might be helpful. And again, the other thing I notice when looking at my diagram is that 2 and 3, if X and Y are parallel, 2 and 3 are same side interior angles, so they are supplementary. So that's going to be kind of my link. 3 is going to be my link there. It's supplementary to 2, it's congruent to 5, so therefore I can do a little bit of a substitution in there. So let's look at our next step. So since I have X and Y are parallel, the first thing I'm going to say is angle 2 and angle 3 are supplementary angles. And that is because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then same side interior angles are supplementary. Now, because I said they're supplementary, I know that when I add them together, I'm going to get 180. So the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 3 is equal to 180, and that's because of definition of supplementary angles. So in looking at our next step, I have 2 and 3 are supplementary, so I need to get to 2 and 5. So now I need to do my link. So the angle 3 is congruent to angle 5, and that is because vertical angles are congruent. Now I can also add that measure of angle 3 is equal to the measure of angle 5. I'm going to need that in a little bit since I'm going to be substituting in an equation. I need to make my, I need an equal sign there so I can do some substitution. So in number 5, in step 5, I'm going to say the measure of angle 2. Now instead of saying the measure of angle 3 as I did in step 3, I'm now going to replace that with 5. The measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 5 is equal to 180, and that's from substitution. And in my last step, I've said 2 and 5 together. When I add them together, I get 180. So now I can say angle 2 and angle 5 are supplementary, and that is because of definition of supplementary angles. My next proof says that I'm given information C is parallel to D, those lines are parallel, and I'm trying to prove that angle 1 is congruent to angle 8. So let's kind of mark where I'm trying to go. So I'm trying to prove that 1 is congruent to 8. There is no direct relationship from there, but I do notice if C and D are parallel like they told us, then I know that 1 and 6 are corresponding angles, and therefore they're congruent. And I also notice that 6 and 8 are vertical angles, so they're congruent. So angle 6 is my link between 1 and 8. So I just need to make sure I include all of those things that I just discussed in my proof. So because these lines are parallel, my next statement is going to be angle 1 is congruent to angle 6. And that is because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. So therefore 1 and 6, I'll kind of mark that 1 and 6, they're congruent. My next step is angle 6 is congruent to angle 8, and that is because vertical angles are congruent. Angle 6 and angle 8 are congruent. And my last step is I have angle 1 is congruent to angle 8, and I have this in the right order. It is a substitution, but this is more specific. It's in the order that I need it to be transitive. So this is a transitive property. Transitive property of congruency. Our last proof for today has a lot going on there. We have a given information of lines C and D are parallel, and we also know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. And we're trying to prove that lines A and B are parallel. So it's kind of an interesting proof in that we're starting with parallel lines and we're trying to prove a different set of lines are parallel. So in my proof I have written down that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. So I'm actually going to mark my diagram there. So I know 1 is congruent to 3. And my next step is C is also parallel to D. We know that. So this is going to be my parallel. I'll mark that as parallel since we have more than one parallel lines here that we're dealing with. So if I know that lines C and D are parallel, then that makes line A a transversal. And I'm going to kind of draw on top of that in red. So that's my transversal. So because that's my transversal, I can say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And again, they're corresponding angles. So I can say if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. So I know 1 and 2 are congruent. Now if you notice, if I'm looking at step 1 and step 3, they're both congruent to angle 1. There's angle 1's congruent to angle 3, and angle 1 also congruent to angle 2. So my next step is going to be angle 3 is congruent to angle 2, and that's because of substitution. They are both congruent to angle 1. Now in doing that, 2 and 3 are congruent. Now that helps us because I'm trying to prove A and B are parallel. So I'm going to use a different color here so you can see it because we have a lot going on in this diagram. If I'm trying to say that A and B are parallel, so if I'm trying to say A and B are parallel, then what happens is line D becomes my transversal. And so if I can prove 2 and 3 are congruent, 2 and 3 are corresponding, and then I know A and B are parallel. Well, in that previous step, I did say that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So therefore, I can say that line A is parallel to line B, and that is because if two lines are cut by a transversal, and corresponding angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel.